All right, guys, welcome back to our APES flipped classroom. We're beginning Unit 5. And Unit 5 is all about the different ways that we use land. So we're going to be covering agriculture, mining, all of the different ways, forestry, grazing, and animal agriculture. So all the different ways that we use land. And we're going to begin by talking about something called the tragedy of the commons. And this is just an idea. It's a theory proposed by Garrett Hardin in the 1960s. And it's just the idea that people tend to overuse shared spaces or public spaces. And mostly because we don't recognize or directly feel the negative consequences of that. And so we use the idea of the tragedy of the commons to explain a lot of things that happen when we are sharing a resource, whether that's something incredibly complex, like an atmosphere, or something super simple, like the pencils that our teachers hand out in class, or why public restrooms are so dirty. So we are going to learn what the tragedy of the commons is today, and we are going to learn how to use it to explain what happens to our environment. So first, we're going to define the tragedy of the commons. So this was originally coined by a British economist who used the example of animals grazing on public lands as an example of how we as individuals use resources in our own self-interest, and that has a negative impact on those public resources, or it degrades them, rather than acting in the interest of everyone or in terms of the greater good. Now, this didn't become mainstream economic theory or environmental theory until the late 1960s, when Garrett Hardin wrote an essay with the title, The Tragedy of the Commons, and he drew on Lloyd's work. And so this basic idea that we would use shared resources in our own self-interest, which then overuses or degrades or depletes them. So in order for something to be considered a tragedy of the commons, it has to meet these two criteria. It has to be a shared resource, cannot be privately owned, and it has to be degraded or depleted or used up in some way. So some examples would be overfishing the oceans, overgrazing, but overgrazing in a public space. So if a farmer overgrazes on their own land, that's not considered a tragedy of the commons because that land is not a commons. Overfishing, because oceans and streams and lakes are public resources, but we can also take it one step farther when we think about the environment and think about water and air pollution as an example of the tragedy of the commons. And that's where we most often see it in environmentalism, although overgrazing and overfishing are definitely examples as well. We can also talk about overuse of groundwater, which again is a common resource. So why does the tragedy of the commons occur? So the biggest reason is if nobody owns this resource, then no one directly suffers the negative consequences of overusing it. So when you own something, if you overuse it and deplete it, then you have to pay to replace it. But if it's a common resource, then no one is having to pay to replace it. So for example, we could talk about companies like Nestle as an example. So Nestle bottles water, and one of the places they bottle water is in Michigan, and they pump water from a well. Well, that well taps an aquifer. That aquifer doesn't belong to Nestle. That aquifer is a public resource. And because they're not paying the cost of overusing the aquifer, of depleting the aquifer, they'll just find another aquifer. If their well runs dry, they'll drill another well or they'll move somewhere else. So they're not directly paying the consequence. Another example or another reason that it happens is that people assume that others are going to overuse the resource if they don't overuse the resource. So if we look at our comic here, last fish in the ocean, and somebody looks a little concerned, but then his boatmate says, well, at least we beat the Russians and the Spaniards to it. So it's this idea that if it's going to get overused, well, then I need to get my share first. And so if we go back to the example of Nestle, they're figuring, well, somebody else might bottle this water, or maybe people are going to use it, or maybe the farmers are going to use it. So we got to get our share first. Most public resources, there's no penalty for overusing them, for degrading them, for polluting them. So if we look at fisheries, unless we have limits and quotas, there's no penalty to overusing that public resource. So this is an example. This is in Peru. This is a dump truck literally dumping trash directly into a river because there are no regulations in place to prevent that trash disposal in the river. So that's the easiest and the cheapest resource, or easiest, cheapest way to dispose of it. So that's what people do. So what's the problem with the tragedy of the commons? Well, if we overfish a resource, we can lead to the collapse of an entire fishery because that population is going to crash. If you don't leave enough organisms in place to reproduce, then it's going to affect the entire fishery and there aren't going to be enough organisms to reproduce. That will ultimately affect the fishermen because they're going to lose their income. Anyone who depends on those fish for subsistence is going to starve. So if we look at this example of the Atlantic cod, you can see that we went along and the number of fish that were being caught increased and increased and increased pretty steadily until the early 1970s when we hit a huge peak, 800,000 tons of fish being caught. And then you can see that there's this dramatic plummet. And that's because there were too few fish there. So they weren't able to reproduce. And then they started to rebound. And then in 1992, the cod stocks absolutely collapsed. There were pretty much none left to be caught. And that was an example of overfishing. So this resource that was being shared, this common resource, was overused and depleted. We can talk about air pollution. So coal power plants create air pollution. The type of pollution that they create can lead to bronchitis. It can lead to asthma. It can lead to increased healthcare costs. So the company that is doing the polluting does not pay the cost of that healthcare. Individuals pay increased prices for their healthcare because they have asthma or because they live in an area where they're more likely to have asthma. And even the American taxpayer pays the price here because all of us wind up having to cover insurance for people who cannot afford it in the form of Medicaid and Medicare. So everyone suffers in this case, but the company that's doing the polluting does not. One more place is pesticide runoff from farms, which can contaminate drinking water. And so when farmers use pesticides, they're treating their own crops, but if it runs off, now it's in a commons, in a river, a lake, a stream of some sort, or perhaps even in the groundwater, and that's being contaminated. And the farmer is not paying the price for that contamination, but we are in terms of the impact on the environment and possibly even an impact on humans who drink water from that source. So we call these negative costs that are not accounted for in the price externalities, and we can have both positive externalities and negative externalities. So when it's a positive externality, it's a benefit that isn't accounted for in the price. But more often we talk about negative externalities, which are those costs that are associated with something that we as humans do, but that are not accounted for in the price. So how do we solve the problem of the tragedy of the commons? Well, one way is through private land ownership. So we all know that we take better care of our own things than of something that we are simply borrowing or using. So if we look at the example of public restrooms, right? So your own bathroom in your house, you keep clean because you use it and you own it. Or maybe just because mom makes you. Public restrooms, nobody owns it. And so nobody feels invested in keeping it clean. And so the people who use it maybe take a little bit less care of that space. And so private land ownership means that people will take care of the land because they own it and they would suffer the consequences of it. Another common way to deal with the tragedy of the commons is to have fees or taxes for the use of a commons space. So very often when we talk about agriculture, we'll talk about grazing on public lands through the Bureau of Land Management. And so there's a permit system in place and farmers have to pay in order to use that land for grazing. And so that tends to reduce the amount of overuse. Logging, when companies have to pay for the amount of wood that they remove, then that tends to keep the amount that they remove under control. Of course, we also have taxes and fines and criminal charges for pollution of those shared air, soil, and water resources. If we go back to the fees and taxes, sorry, one more thing. Another in the same vein, we can talk about quotas. So if you guys have ever watched things like Deadliest Catch, and they talk about the quota for crab fishing. And so what that does is that it creates a limit on use. Permit systems, if they're going to be effective to solve the tragedy of the commons, whether it's permits, fees, taxes, or quotas, they have to be a significant enough cost to prevent the overuse. So if we go back to the example of Nestle, they pay about $2,000 a year for the water that they extract from the ground, but they sell over $300 million a year in water. And so the amount that they are paying is just pennies compared to the amount of profit that they're able to make. So it's not going to dissuade them from using that. So it has to be proportional. So some examples of regulations that help with the tragedy of the commons are the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So those laws give states and the Environmental Protection Agency authority to fine companies or sue companies that pollute air and water systems. In the case of the rangeland, we have the Bureau of Land Management that is responsible for permitting and for monitoring the land to make sure that the agriculture is taking care of the land and repairing the effects of overgrazing. Okay. Here's our practice FRQ for today. We frequently talk about the oceans of the world as a commons. So I want you to identify one other commons besides the oceans, explain how our activities affect that commons, and I want you to propose a solution for managing that commons. All right, as always, I look forward to hearing your questions and I'll see you in class.